We're still a few months away from the release of the PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X, but already, the console war is heating up. Both Sony and Microsoft have revealed the full specs of their next-generation consoles, and based on these specs, it seems that the Xbox Series X has a power advantage over the PlayStation 5. The Series X has a faster CPU at 3.8 GHz compared to the PlayStation 5's 3.5, and a video card with 12 teraflops compared to the PlayStation 5's 10 teraflops. So you have a lot of fanboys that are saying that's it, the Xbox Series X is going to win this generation because it is the most powerful console. Except when we're talking about consoles, power is never the deciding factor in a console winning the generation. It's just not. Because never mind all the stuff I talked about in the previous video, the fact that Microsoft is probably going to release a lighter version of the Series X that doesn't have as powerful specs, but can still run the games, but it's not going to have nearly the power that they're advertising on the main version of the Series X. So that's one factor, is that you might actually have multiple different iterations of the same console, kind of like what we had with the Xbox One and the Xbox One X, PS4, PS4 Pro. We might have something like that this generation. That's one thing, which means not all Xbox players might even have those powerful specs that you guys are bragging about. Second point is, we still don't know the price difference between the Series X and the PlayStation 5. If the PlayStation 5 is cheaper than the Series X, if the Series X is $100 more, then it doesn't matter how powerful the console is, the PlayStation 5 is going to have a serious advantage. That's another thing as well. But here's the thing that annoys me the most, when we have console fanboys going at each other about which console is the most powerful. What is the most powerful console on the market? It's like, this system is inferior because the system I play on is more powerful and is superior, graphically speaking. Which seems to indicate that you get the most enjoyment out of your games when they look the best, when they have the best performance, and ultimately are the most powerful version of that game, right? So if that's your reason why you're so hyped about the Series X, why are you buying an Xbox Series X instead of a gaming PC that will always be the most powerful gaming platform on the market? And this isn't me being a PC elitist, being a PC fanboy. It's just interesting to me how you guys are being the elitist over PlayStation 5 people because you have the most powerful specs, yet you hate the PC master race also? You can't have it both ways. Either you hate the PC elitists that brag about their graphics, or you're bragging about the Xbox Series X having the best graphics. And I don't care if you're the most hardcore Xbox fanboy, you have to at least admit that while the Xbox Series X does seem more powerful than the PlayStation 5, it's not a generational difference where you're actually going to have more third-party support on the Series X and games that won't be on the PlayStation 5 because the games just can't handle it on the PS5, and the Series X is just so much more powerful that developers are going to come. No, that's not going to happen, okay? Yeah, they have that power advantage, Microsoft, and games will ultimately look better on their platform than they will on the PlayStation 5, but why does that matter? Why are people so obsessed with the specs? Being the most powerful console doesn't automatically mean that it's going to succeed over the competition. In fact, you look at all the console generations, we've had 8 going in 9 so far. Not a single one of those generations has the most powerful console been the best-selling and the most successful one. Not a single time in history has that ever happened. Has power been the deciding factor in whether or not a console won the generation? I mean, you can argue that with the PlayStation 4, the power advantage they had over the Xbox One was a key moment in them winning the generation, but that's not really true, because you look at the Nintendo Switch, which is less powerful than the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, was released in 2017, and in less than 3 years, the Nintendo Switch has already outsold the Xbox One, which had a 3-4 year advantage over the Nintendo Switch. The Switch was still able to outsell the Xbox One. So power isn't really a deciding factor. Go further back in the 7th generation. Remember, the PlayStation 3 was more powerful than the Xbox 360, and it was certainly more powerful than the Wii, which came out within a week of each other. The Wii easily destroyed the PlayStation 3, and the Xbox 360 also kicked PlayStation's ass at that point as well. Now, Sony eventually recovered in that generation, and at the end, the PlayStation 3 actually sold a couple more million units than the Xbox 360. But the Nintendo Wii, which was basically a recycled GameCube, destroyed the 360 and the PS3 easily. The Wii sold over 100 million units, while the 360 and PS3 each sold around 80 million units, so it wasn't even close. But since we've been talking about Xbox, how about the 6th generation, which the Xbox first existed? Microsoft's first console was the original Xbox, and was considerably more powerful than the PlayStation 2, the GameCube, and especially the Dreamcast, which was long gone at that point. But remember, the PlayStation 2 had a pretty weak processor. The Xbox had over double the processing speed as the PlayStation 2, and a much better graphics card, and twice the RAM. I mean, you look at the difference between the PlayStation 5 and the Series X, the difference between the PS2 and the Xbox was far more drastic than what we have right now. Yet, the PlayStation 2 destroyed the original Xbox. And you could say, well, it's because it was their first console, they entered the market pretty late, but then again, you know, Nintendo entered the market pretty late in the 8th gen, and they still destroyed the Xbox One, but never mind that. But it was still their first console, they were just figuring out what to do, and blah blah blah. Okay, but what about the 5th generation? When the PlayStation 1, it was the first time Sony made a console, and they obliterated Nintendo with their Nintendo 64, and Sega, the Sega Saturn as well. The PlayStation 1 was not the most powerful console that generation, though. That was actually the Nintendo 64. A lot of people wrongfully assumed that the PlayStation 1 had a power advantage over the Nintendo 64, but it was really Sony using discs and Nintendo sticking with cartridges that made it seem like the PlayStation had a power advantage. It was really a capacity advantage when it came to holding data in a game, and that's why a lot of third-party publishers went over to the PlayStation 1, because while the Nintendo 64 did have that power advantage, they had more polygons, greater rendering capabilities, and overall stronger performance on their games than the PlayStation 1, Sony obliterated Nintendo. I mean, for a company that had the entire gaming industry on lock for almost 20 years, they got their asses handed to them that generation, Nintendo. They only sold 30 million Nintendo 64s, while PlayStation, the new console, the new kid on the block, sold 100 million units. And the further back along you go in history, the trend remains the same. The most powerful console on the market did not win the generation. The Super Nintendo had a power advantage over Sega with the Genesis, with more RAM, 3 times the colors displayed on screen, and ultimately a good power advantage over the Genesis. Even though the Genesis had a much faster processor, Nintendo ultimately had the better looking games. Yeah, they won against the Genesis, but then the TurboGrafx 16, do you guys remember that console? It was the most powerful console that generation, yet it didn't even have a sizable chunk of the game market. It was pretty much a commercial failure. The Master System in the 3rd gen had 4 times the RAM, twice the colors, high resolutions, but still couldn't even come close to beating the Nintendo Entertainment System. And if you go all the way back to the Atari 2600, I mean, that console was nowhere even close to being the most powerful console on the market. The Intellivision, which was the 2nd largest console, had a pretty significant power advantage. Games looked better, games ran better, but the 2600 still easily won over the Intellivision. So I think the point I'm trying to make here is that power doesn't really matter when it comes to which console is the most successful in that generation, because not once has the most powerful console ended up actually winning the generation. It was the games. It all comes down to the games. And if Microsoft doesn't step their game up, they're going to run into the same problems that they did last generation with people just not caring. All the consoles that we talked about that won the generation, whether it was the 2600, the NES, which actually had some pretty shitty monopolistic business practices that kept them on top, the Super Nintendo, the PlayStation 1, the PlayStation 2, the Wii, and the PS4, it wasn't power that won that generation for them. It was the games. It's always the games when we're talking about a game console. Atari had the games, much larger library than any of the competitors that you had during the 2nd generation. Nintendo had the games by preventing third-party publishers from putting their games on other platforms. Nintendo had the games again in the 4th generation, though it was much closer because Sega actually started to have third-party support, and they actually had some good exclusives like Sonic the Hedgehog, so that gap was closed much further than the third gen between Sega and Nintendo. The PlayStation 1 had a lot of amazing exclusives, and so did Nintendo, but PlayStation was really the first console that made a big push to market their game system towards more mature audiences, so you had a more diverse age group than Nintendo, which just marketed their game towards children. And obviously with the PlayStation 2, you had a lot of great exclusive content, but the third-party support was just so much more strong on the PS2 than any of the other consoles that were out at that point, so PlayStation 2 had the games. The PlayStation 3 got their asses beat for the longest time. When they started coming out with really good exclusives around 2008-2009, they started to close the gap with Microsoft, and Nintendo was just Nintendo, and they destroyed everybody that generation. Had a lot to do with the motion controls, but ultimately they had a lot of good games like Mario Galaxy and such that people really wanted to play. And I think the 8th generation is the best example of this, because PlayStation 4 had the power advantage over the Xbox One, but then Nintendo Switch came out the same year as the Xbox One X, the most powerful console to ever exist at that point, and it wasn't even close. Nintendo obliterated Microsoft, because, let's face it, the Xbox One has no games worth playing at least. So whoever wins the next generation, whether it's Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo, it's gonna come down to who has the best games on their platform. Whether you like to admit it or not, exclusive content matters. And you don't really have much of a game console without the games. And you fanboys need to start realizing that.